Tom Pelissero, what a heck of a day he and my colleague Ian Rappaport had on behalf of all of us at NFL Network, NFL Media Group. He's the one who tweeted this. I saw his tweet during the commercial break.
Whoa!
I said out loud, I'm like, whoa.
And I'm like, wait, what?
And then you looked and you saw
and I was just,
reporting that the Broncos had acquired Russell Wilson from the Seahawks. Tom Pelissero back here on the Rich Eisen Show. How you doing, Tom?
I'm doing well, Rich. How are you?
I'm doing all right. So let's dive right into it. The origin of this. How did it start? What do you got?
Really, these conversations between the Seahawks and Broncos had been going on for weeks, and it heated up last week at the scouting combine when George Paton and John Schneider met face-to-face and really began to talk about the compensation. You know, it was really about the Seahawks, for everything they had said publicly that they had no plans to trade Russell. That really meant behind the scenes they were only going to trade him if it was a transformational type of deal. They were absolutely prepared to move forward with Russell Wilson as their quarterback in 2022. They did not get that, but the Broncos stepped up. And when you look at the compensation, 2 number ones, including the number 9 overall pick, 2 second-rounders, and 3 players, including a quarterback who's still young, that the Seahawks liked coming out in the draft, a tight end in Noah Fant who's pretty good, and a guy in Shelby Harris who's got a reasonable deal and is a pretty good veteran defensive player. It made sense, and it also sets up Seattle now to have the collateral here to go and make potentially another move to go get their next quarterback.
So what about the idea that the Washington Commanders were going YOLO and might still be all over the league right now for somebody like Russell Wilson's caliber and made a better deal or offered a richer deal? Maybe they don't have the players to come back. What can you tell me about the idea of maybe Denver being in the AFC? Russell wanted them. What about that? Anything on that front?
It had a lot to do with where Russell Wilson wanted to go. He had a no-trade clause, and there's a unique relationship between Russell Wilson and the Seahawks where, throughout the course of this offseason, he and Pete Carroll had a lot of conversations. They were very open, and Russell would talk about different places he might like to go play. It's unusual, to say the least, that you have that type of a relationship, but on the short list of teams that he wanted to go to was Denver. And so my understanding was, especially in the last few days here, as this became very real, Russell was very excited about the idea of going to the Broncos, being able to play with some really good young talent, and really being able to get kind of a reboot on his career here. So once the compensation matched up, it moved pretty swiftly. Regardless of what any other team might have offered, Russell Wilson needed to be all in on going to that place, and Denver checked a lot of the boxes that he was looking for.
So why does this have to happen? What happened here? What happened to this relationship, Tom?
I think that sometimes people can reduce things to only one factor. I think that all of us who live here on planet Earth know that interpersonal relationships are inherently complicated, and that was certainly the case with Russell Wilson. There had been so much transition when you talk about, the fact that I believe Russell Wilson and Bobby Wagner were the only 2 players left from the Super Bowl winning team. That's the nature of the NFL. Things had evolved. Russell Wilson still did have a supporting cast there. I mean, there's plenty of quarterbacks out there who would go, if this guy doesn't want to play with Tyler Lockett and DK Metcalf and Chris Carson when he's healthy and, all those types of things. I'd go in there. I'd play with those guys. But for us, it was more complicated than that. He's always envisioned himself as somebody who is one of the greats and wants to be a Hall of Famer, and he wants to win Super Bowls, and he wants to win the MVP, and he's never even gotten an MVP vote. And you see how many different things the Seahawks did over the course of time to try to give Russell what he wanted, whether it was, making deals, and Wilson would regularly talk to the front office. Every star player who became available, he wanted to bring those guys in. He had one of the most aggressive GMs in John Schneider, who was always trying to add those missing pieces to the roster. But it's also a matter of, they were going to be a defense-first, run-first type of team for a long time under Pete Carroll. He got up to that hot start in 2020 where they were throwing the ball a lot more. Then he went through a tough stretch. Defense has changed a little bit how they were playing the Seahawks. Pete wanted to get back to running, so they weren't turning the ball over so much. And those MVP hopes and all that talk kind of went away. And that's not to say that he's got an agreement now that Nathaniel Hackett's going to have him throw the ball 60 times a game. I don't think that's going to be it at all, but it's an opportunity right now for him to go to the next thing. And for the Seahawks, there has to be some level of fatigue knowing that you went through all this last offseason, all the speculation and all the questions, and now this offseason, the same thing was happening. You know this would never end. It would continue into the future. And so once you get the type of package that John Schneider and Pete Carroll thought would help the team, not just now but in the big picture, it made a lot of sense for them to say this is the right time to reboot, even though you've got a 70-year-old coach in Pete Carroll who has no interest in rebuilding. Again, they've got a lot more assets now, and I expect that they're going to be aggressive to add pieces to their team and try to win in 2022.
I'm going to be blunt, Tom Pelissero, since you were saying, like, here on planet Earth, interpersonal relationships are difficult. It sure sounds, if I read between the tea leaves, that both sides were sick of each other after all this time. What would you say to that?
And, again, I'd say Pete and Russ talked a lot in this offseason. It wasn't as if this was some, cold shoulder thing where they weren't on speaking terms anymore. They were angry at each other. It just was, it would be unusual. But if, eventually, if, you seem to have a good relationship with your wife and you've been together for 10 years, and then, every January, February, she starts talking about, hey, what if I was married to that guy? At some point, you might go, you know what? Maybe you should be married to that guy. I mean, I think that there's just some of that where it's just, that relationship over time, it didn't necessarily fray. It's not like these two didn't like each other. Go back to the meaningless Week 18 game that I believe they won, and those two are jumping around together, high-fiving. Like, they're both highly competitive individuals, but it was time. It was time on a lot of different fronts, and, once it made sense for the Seahawks to do the deal, they weren't just going to give them away. Russ wasn't going to, necessarily force his way out. It just, everything lined up, and once that became the case, it became a no-brainer for everyone involved to move forward.
Because if you have, a 33-year-old who's going to be 34 right after Thanksgiving, right? And this is the guy who's been with your team. You drafted him, you nurtured him, you gave him the opportunity. Boy, did he make the most of it. Did he ever make the most of it? And he's so terrific in the community, which loves him. He loves them. He's a Walter Payton Man of the Year award winner because of it. You don't let those guys out of the building, right? You grow old with them. You try again with them. You reload with them. That's the whole idea. And the fact that this hasn't happened here, based on the way that their relationship started, it's kind of stunning. I'll be honest with you. I was there in New York when they won it. I was there in Arizona when they lost it. I was there when they drafted him. Russell Wilson was one of the first guests of the Rich Eisen Show season opening podcast in 2012. Everyone was head over heels with each other, and it's kind of stunning that that's the result. I'll be honest.
Think of it this way, too. If you're processing this from the Seahawks standpoint, just from a completely dispassionate, emotionless roster building standpoint, you also have a quarterback who's now into his 30s, which, of course, we've seen quarterbacks play a lot longer than that. But, they don't necessarily rely on their mobility as much of a factor as Russell Wilson. He goes in the third round because people thought this guy's not going to be able to see. He's 5'11". You're going to have to design a unique offense. And the Seahawks did an unbelievable job of that over the course of the decade, being able to play a certain way that fit Russ's strengths, and he's a phenomenal playmaker. And that's not to say that he's not going to go to Denver and do the same type of things. But if you are strictly evaluating a 30-something-year-old player and you look at the last, let's call it 20 games that Russell Wilson has played, it hasn't been as good. At the end of the 2020 season, the second half of that, when the turnovers came and they got away from throwing the ball as much as they had early in the season, and there were some creative defensive minds out there, guys like Brandon Staley with the Rams, who really played them different, kind of left certain areas of the field open and took away the deep ball and forced Russ to be a precision passer short to intermediate, which is not really his game. He's very much he's always played in a vertical strike type of an offense. That seemed to have an effect. We saw that in the games against the Rams. We saw it when another, really good defensive coordinator, Patrick Graham, came in with a plan for the Giants in a game where the Seahawks didn't play particularly well. And then, of course, you have a couple of injuries thrown in there. That was obviously a factor. The finger was a factor. But the point being, if Russell Wilson came out and played the way he has over the last 20 or so games, again in 2022, now what is the value to the rest of the league? In other words, if you have a year and a half of, it was injuries, it was a coordinator change, it was other injuries on the team, whatever, you can kind of explain that to yourself. If it becomes just 2.5 years of not high, the highest level of Russell Wilson that we've seen, that's going to impact what you can get for him in a trade. So you figure this is the maximum value we probably can get: 2 1s, 2 2s, 3 players. I mean, that's a lot, and not to mention the fact that even if those players don't work out, they walk in free agency, you get comp picks coming back. It made sense for what the Seahawks were trying to accomplish here.
Tom Pelissero, NFL Media Group, here on the Rich Eisen Show. What is Seattle's plan at quarterback now? Short, long term? Is it just start Drew Lock, or do they look in the draft? Do they hope Deshaun Watson clears everything? What do you got for me on that front?
I would say right now all options are on the table for the Seahawks. They did like Drew Lock coming out in the draft. I know that for a fact several years ago. Obviously, he's been inconsistent, which was kind of the knock on him at Missouri too, but big arms, super athletic, tall guy, all that stuff. Had some unfortunate injuries, but there might be something there, and they'd like to see what it is. The draft is certainly an option. I don't know that it's going to make sense to take somebody at number 9, but you have the flexibility with those additional picks now to move around in the draft. And I would expect that they're going to be in on the trade market. The Deshaun Watson situation, and he continues to face serious allegations of sexual misconduct. This is coming to a head, legally speaking, over the next several days, because on Friday, the district attorney in Harris County, Texas, is going to present her case to the grand jury. Grand juries in Texas can move pretty quickly, so you could potentially have an answer even on Friday, but if not that, then by next week in terms of whether there's going to be any criminal charges against him. His civil deposition also scheduled for Friday. His attorney, Rusty Hardin, whose name I'm sure you've heard a lot through the years, is advising him to invoke the Fifth Amendment, just because you don't want somebody testifying in a civil case while you have an active criminal case. But once the criminal case and you have clarity on that, that can trigger a lot in terms of the civil cases getting resolved, and then it'll be in the hands of the NFL. There's not enough quarterbacks. We all know that. We also know the seriousness of the allegations involving Deshaun Watson. I would fairly say that, considering the fact there were multiple teams last year, both before training camp, in training camp, and again at the trade deadline, who were willing to offer 3 first-round picks and more for Deshaun Watson, you're going to find a market again, and the Texans will be able to get substantial value for him. So whether that's Seattle, whether that's Carolina, whether that's someplace else, I do anticipate you're going to see Deshaun Watson be traded this time around. That's going to be a key name in this entire picture for the NFL.
Well, Seattle certainly has more draft capital now than they did at this point yesterday. So they're in a better position for that. But, they might, if this doesn't get cleared before the draft, they'll have to use that draft capital. I mean, the clock is clearly ticking on so many fronts on that. Tom Pelissero here on the Rich Eisen Show. Before I let you go, Denver must be over the moon. They must be, everybody you speak to from the Broncos must be out of their minds over the moon right now. Certainly because you could make the case the AFC West is the deepest quarterback pool in the NFL. Best division at that position. And they've now got somebody who can go toe-to-toe with everybody in that spot, right?
It was the priority of the entire offseason. They feel like they've got a foundation. They've got good receivers, Jerry Jeudy, Cortland Sutton. They got a young stud running back in Javonte Williams. They've made a lot of progress in terms of solidifying the offensive line. Pat Surtain looks like a young star on defense. They probably need to add another pass rusher. I'd expect that they try to address that in free agency. If Bradley Chubb can stay healthy, he's still a really, really talented player. They got a lot of pieces, but they needed the quarterback. And so absolutely, they expect they're going to be able to compete right now. They were going to swing big. Aaron Rodgers, Russell Wilson, those were the 2 priorities. I got the sense in recent weeks that Russell Wilson may actually have been plan A, just because of, with Aaron Rodgers, you don't know how long is he actually going to play. Are you going to do the retirement dance every year if you bring him in? With Russell, you're hoping that he's going to be back, he's going to be healthy, he's going to be the Russell Wilson we've seen in the past, and you may have your quarterback for the next 5 to 10 years. So absolutely a huge day for the Broncos. And let me also, Rich, really quickly clarify something, because I heard the caller before I came on asking about why you couldn't wait a day for Bobby Wagner. What I am told on that with the Seahawks releasing him was this was going to happen. It was going to happen probably toward the end of this week. But after the Russell Wilson trade, Bobby Wagner actually contacted the Seahawks to ask, what's happening here. The Seahawks felt that it was appropriate for them to grant him his release so he can immediately have a chance to sign up.
How about that? Do you think Bobby Wagner goes to Denver? What about Vaughn?
I don't know. It's early on Bobby Wagner. Let's start there. I would expect that he's going to have a market. With Von Miller, is unbelievable as it seems and seemed when he was traded away. I do believe that will be a consideration, the possibility he heads back to Denver. And listen, this is the type of thing that Russell Wilson has always wanted. He's always wanted to be the LeBron James of the NBA, the Tom Brady, bring guys in, everybody go and play on the super team. They got a lot of good players in Denver, but to the extent that Russell Wilson can, I would expect him to be a very active recruiter, as he was for years in Seattle, and it'll be fascinating to see, just exactly how everything else flows from a roster building standpoint as they get ready for the 2022 season.
Tom, great stuff. Great job. Let's talk early next week in the middle of the frenzy, as we call it on the network. So thanks for the call.
Sounds great, Rich. Thanks.
You got it. Tom Pelissero. Follow him on Twitter. I do. That's how I found out about the Russell Wilson trade. Hey, you watched all the way to the end. Thanks for that. Watch more right here.